Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, State of Fraud, Why Consumers Blame Merchants for Fraud. Appreciate everyone for showing up and lending an ear today. We will start the presentation in just a few minutes. We're going to give folks a minute to come online, but please stay on the line and we will begin shortly. Hello, my name is DJ Murphy. I am the editor-in-chief of CardNotPresent.com. I want to thank everybody for joining us today for our webinar, State of Fraud, Why Consumers Blame Merchants for Fraud. We focus on e-commerce payments and fraud here at CNP, and sometimes we get caught up a lot worrying about beating the bad guys, and that's where our focus is. It's on making sure that we're equipped with everything we need to face off against this foe that's on our minds every day. But it's worth remembering that the basis of the entire industry that we're in is to sell as much as we can to the good guys. Therefore, an understanding of consumers and their needs and their desires is really, really super important. And to do that, I feel you need good data. We get questions all the time from folks about trends, about things we're seeing. They're really starving and thirsting for good information out there, and that's one of the reasons they come to us. But for that reason, that very reason, I'm really excited today to introduce Adam Chandler. Adam is from Riskified. Riskified is a technology provider in the e-commerce and fraud space, and they recently performed a survey to try and answer some of the questions that you folks ask every day. Questions surrounding the ways consumers want to shop, and more importantly for you folks on the call, their perceptions of fraud and what inspires their trust in merchants. I'm going to turn it over to Adam in just a second, but before I do, I want to remind everybody that he will be taking questions at the end. There's a questions tab in your webinar dashboard. Please enter a question at any time. We'll try to get to all of them. If we don't, somebody will get back to you offline and definitely answer your question. So don't be shy about asking questions. Please do that. Also, we will be recording the session today. So if you miss any of it, either at the beginning or the end, or you just want to see the presentation again and check out some of the insights that Adam's going to be sharing with you, again, that will be available on CardNotPresent.com shortly after the event. We will send an email out to all the folks who registered to tell them when the recording is available. So I'm going to turn it over right now to Adam Chandler. Adam, thank you so much for joining us, and take it away.
All right, thank you, DJ, so much. I appreciate it. And thanks everyone for joining us today as we discuss the state of fraud in 2019 and why consumers blame merchants for fraud. So as DJ mentioned, back in December, Riskified conducted a survey where we asked 5,000 American consumers across all demographic, age, financial categories to answer about 30 questions about their e-commerce behaviors. Specifically, we wanted to know what makes them trust a particular merchant, how they view fraud, and what keeps them from completing a purchase at the very last minute. So today we'll be looking at their responses, which quite frankly offered us some surprises and some unexpected insights as well. So let's dive in. Here's how the next, I'd say roughly 30 minutes or so are going to look, depending on your questions. We're going to start with a short overview of the e-commerce market and then delve a little bit into how customers shop and which devices they use, and what it all means for fraud managers. Then we're going to tackle how fraud and friction factor into the shopping experience and kind of look into why even motivated shoppers abandon their carts. And finally, we're going to look at how to build trust and loyalty in an era where it's never been more difficult to do so. So just to jump in now, Before we start all that though, if you don't know us yet, you may be wondering, who is Riskified? Well, for starters, we're an AI platform and an end-to-end e-commerce fraud management solution. We review over 1 million orders a day, and our main focus is to boost approval rates and deliver decisions in less than a second. We started in Tel Aviv back in 2013, and we pioneered the 100% chargeback guarantee. It's this last part that's particularly important because it means that on every single transaction, we learn something new. Otherwise, we'd be out of business. So we work with some of the largest merchants in the world. We approve orders across hundreds of countries and 6 continents. I'm told that if we ever approve a transaction from Antarctica, sorry, you'll be the first to know. So you've heard it here. And now let's talk some shop. Just starting out with a little bit of context here. Here's a quick snapshot of the consumer landscape. In large part, it boils down to this idea, which I'm sure you know. While it's never been easier to be a consumer, it's never been harder to be a merchant, to operate, to safely approve orders. The world is the customer's oyster. You have endless choices, Amazon in an hour, 1-day shipping, and everyone listening in right now is possibly your competitor, and they know all too well that there are enormous pressures to get things right. The margins of error, in short, have never been thinner. So the challenges are huge, the competition is fierce, the landscape is changing quickly, and retailers have to adapt to reach the endless ways that people are shopping today. So wouldn't it just be easier to wind down e-commerce shopping and return to the barter system, say? And of course, the answer is no, of course not. Do you see how much revenue would be lost if we packed our bags and let Jeff Bezos have it? So as you can see by this chart, the age of e-commerce is still in its relative infancy. We might think about ourselves as part of this hyper-connected, constantly on-the-go world, but in this year alone, in the US, less than 12% of all transactions will be made online. And what that ultimately means is that the consumer base is only going to grow. And the next several years will have more and more shoppers entering the market to find exactly what they want and to trust that it'll be available to them. So one interesting thing that we found in our consumer survey is that nearly more than 50% of consumers across nearly all generational categories were only making online purchases 2 to 3 times a month. In fact, less than 30% of respondents total said that they made purchases several times a week. And only millennials were the age bracket that broached 50%. So the takeaway here really is for merchants to be truly ready for the future. It isn't just about staying ahead of the curve as far as the trends are concerned. It's also about having the infrastructure and the readiness to scale and safely reach new audiences and new markets. So now that we figured out how frequently American shoppers are making purchases, we wanted to look into how they were buying. So if you're a merchant or you represent a merchant, think about the primary way that your customers are shopping. And feel free to shout out the answer, especially if you have an open office plan. If you said in real life, for example, you represent the majority. If you said desktop computers, then more than likely your consumer base is over 40. If you said smartphones, then you probably have a consumer base that's under 40. And if you said laptops, you represent the biggest percentage of e-commerce sales in the US right now. So as you can see, the digital spread was pretty different across age brackets between smartphones, tablets, and desktops. But ultimately, laptops led the way, with smartphones not too far behind. So what's the consensus? We're looking at diversity of devices here, and what we're seeing is that respondents don't just have different preferences among generations. It highlights a major challenge for merchants and fraud managers. How do you look at all this? How do you take all this information where people are shopping completely different ways? And it's a big shrug, as Han Solo would say. How do you create a purchase journey that seamlessly adapts to all the different ways that customers are buying today? And the takeaway is that it's crucial to know how your customers shop and to make sure that you're not using old e-commerce data points, whether it's AVS, mismatches of from a rule-based system, or unenriched data, or if you have a natural bias against Wi-Fi networks, you're more than likely hemming yourself in the market. So there are also a few other curiosities from our survey, very strange consumer habits, we called them. One trend, major trend, unsurprisingly, is that consumers are looking for the best possible deals, even if that meant going to a store, finding something they like, and looking for it online while they were physically shopping. So that's one aspect of it. And the seeking out of deals is just one component of this equation. They'll abandon their carts if they don't like what they see. In our survey, 71.7% of all shoppers told us they abandoned their carts after they encountered unexpected fees at checkout, whether it was big taxes or shipping fees or anything that kind of struck them as giving them pause or undesirable. And we also found a couple other interesting curiosities, particularly among the millennial set. So that's right, forget avocado toast, forget the emojis, forget the quinoa. Some of the worst consumer sins committed by millennials is that they shop while they go on dates and while they're in the restroom. And while these activities may strike us as unsavory, there's an important meaning to these behaviors. Consumers, especially millennials, like to shop how and when it suits them. It's not rocket science, but being optimized for mobile is exactly what can help you capture the largest consumer demographic out there right now. And this means having a checkout that's geared for on-the-go shoppers, as well as a fraud prevention system that's geared to not view mobile purchases as inherently suspicious or sketchy. Speaking of which, this doesn't end this strange consumer behavior. In fact, the quest for cheaper deals in e-commerce has led some more industrious consumers to kind of scam their way into discounts, either by creating multiple email addresses or by claiming legitimate purchases to be fraudulent. I'm sure you're working with fraud enough to know the term liar buyer, which is a difficult form of fraud to combat. So interestingly, in our survey, we asked about this phenomenon and found that the higher income segments reported the highest rates of liar buyer fraud. They would basically just admit that almost 50% of respondents making $1 million or more in annual income said they reported a legitimate purchase as fraudulent. And in some instances, the reasons they gave were that they simply just didn't want to go through the process of returning an item, which is not something anybody wants to hear. Now, one thing a merchant can do to combat this is partner with a delivery service that offers a confirmation service. This is something small and may add a little bit of friction, but if liar buyer is an excessive cost of doing business, it's worth considering. But taking a step back, broadly speaking, and looking at these behaviors, they eat away from precious revenue as well as marketing and fraud management budgets that are designed to build new customer bases and more or less preserve the order. So before a merchant can actually combat this, they have to be able to detect it first. At Riskified, to sort of have a view of this, we rely on behavioral analytics and we dispatch our web beacon to sort of suss out fraud, large and small, even people scheming on referral or first-time discounts. So adding to the pressure of being a merchant in today's environment isn't just the sheer number of ways that orders are being placed or the tendency to use e-commerce to scam for more discounts. It's also how the orders themselves are being placed. If there's one thing that kind of rounds out a portrait of a typical US consumer, it's that in addition to being thrifty, sketchy, and often on the go, it's that they're often pressed for time. As you can see from this stat here, these responses were kind of alarming. You hear of consumers walking down the street making purchases, buying something at soccer games, their kids' soccer games, looking for things at any free moment and wanting it immediately. The problem is that the consumers who need an order fulfilled or delivered quickly add another layer of anxiety to the entire purchase process. If there's even the slightest delay or friction in the journey, that revenue is often lost. And if you're the one approving the order, you're kind of in a position, well, you don't have a lot of time. What do I do? So this brings us to one of the biggest lessons of our consumer survey, which is essentially how friction leads to lost revenue. And customers are a fickle lot, and their priorities shift across demographic bounds. For example, of the wealthiest we surveyed, the millionaire respondents had the least patience for a long checkout process. 37.3 abandoned a purchase because of a complicated checkout, while 34.9% of them had no tolerance for a bad mobile experience. And both of these were the highest, second highest rate of abandonment of any income level. But sadly, the infrastructure of the e-commerce universe is a bit more complicated than just sliding cash across the counter. What we have to do is create a seamless purchase journey, and that's at the heart of what merchants can do to keep their customers loyal and active. But if you look at this chart here, I mean, philosophically, the responses given for why certain shoppers abandon a purchase really strikes at the heart of why the e-commerce world is so trying and challenging when it comes to fraud, and that there's a delicate balance between providing a purchase journey that goes quickly and smoothly and one that seems trustworthy and safe. And those concepts themselves, as we all know, are kind of relative. So oftentimes the pressure and the race to approve customers quickly leads many merchants to improvise. In other words, you approve what you can and reject any orders that look suspicious. And sadly, as you can see here, it leads to a lot of declines. Declines are, simply put, the worst possible thing that can happen to a merchant, whether it's a bank rejecting a customer without a merchant even knowing it, or a false decline. Few things have a more negative or damaging effect on customer loyalty and the merchant bottom line than a decline happy kind of dynamic. And it's not that it just leads to lost revenue, it's that it leads to lost loyalty. So in our survey, 30% of our respondents told us that they had been wrongly rejected while placing an order. Now, for a merchant, this has to sound like a Greek tragedy. You've worked hard to woo a customer with a quality product. You've targeted them with marketing, maybe some social media. You've built up a good reputation. And in the blink of an eye, shopper pulls the trigger and gets declined. But the agony itself doesn't stop there. That's right. According to our survey, and the results showed that a majority of the rejected customers are returning customers. These are people whose loyalty had been hard won. So then what happens? Well, while some declined customers try the purchase again or even seek out the product at a physical store, assuming there is one, that's not always the case. As you can see, oftentimes a declined customer abandoned the purchase or, even worse, took their business to a competitor. And so what you're seeing here is that the effect of a false decline or declined payments aren't just one-time costs. They compound across the lifetime of a consumer. And that's not even taking the actual fraud into account. So unfortunately, when a merchant has a fraud incident, whether it means approving a fraudulent order or suffering an account takeover attack, the customer tends not to understand exactly what's happened and isn't quite sure who to blame in the scenario. Younger shoppers, we found, tend to blame themselves when their cards are used for fraud, while older customers tend to look at the merchant more, which is extremely tragic for the merchant because the merchant is also the victim. So in total, what we're seeing here is that 28.8% of victims of fraud blame the merchant that accepted the payment for the fraud. That's adding to the fact that the cost of approving a fraudulent order is already huge. But that's only one factor. According to our survey, 49.9% of survey respondents reported that they would not be willing to shop with a merchant where the fraud occurred. And another 55.3% of victims of account takeover would refuse to shop at that merchant. So it's not just that fraud has a negative impact on the bottom line, it is a loss that also compounds, even in ways when the merchant is the victim. And a lot of this speaks of trust that's difficult to regain. But sadly, it doesn't look like fraud is going away anytime soon. As you can see, the arc of the e-commerce universe is long, but sadly, it bends towards fraud. And each bad customer experience isn't just a financial hit. It's also a setback to a merchant's reputation. So by staying ahead of fraud and limiting friction, the explosive growth that will accompany the arrival of millions of new e-commerce shoppers in the coming years can be a reason for celebration instead of worry. And one surefire way to do this is to partner with somebody who studies the trends, learns on every transaction, and can take all the worrying off your plate. So, a few takeaways here. While it's never easier to be a consumer, it's never been harder to be a merchant. With endless options come endless complications. And when it comes to safely approving more orders, it's never been more difficult. So are you ready for the bright future ahead with all of these people joining the market in the coming years? Second, you have to know how your customers are actually shopping. What are their habits? What are their behaviors? What are their preferences? How frequently are they shopping and what device are they using? And you have to connect these to your fraud process. Seeing how friction and fraud factors into everything, it's sort of like the way people talk about jazz. It's not the transactions that are happening, it's the transactions that are not happening. And why? What obstacles are keeping customers from checking out? And how do declines factor in? So fraud is a lifetime problem. It was a lifetime cost and a growing problem. And hell hath no fury like a customer declined or defrauded. And so you can't let one-time losses become lifetime losses. And I'm seeing we have a few questions out there.
Yeah, we do, Adam. Thank you very much. I appreciate all those insights. Are really some really interesting things. Yeah, we have a couple questions that came in. The first one asks, did the survey uncover any data about the frequency of CMP fraud in terms of, by population, percent of population?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So what we're seeing, I guess, in this survey is that being a victim of credit card fraud, CMP fraud, isn't quite inevitable, but it's not that far off. What we found is that the percentage of people who responded in our survey to having been victims of credit card fraud increased with age. So by the time you are in your early 30s, it crosses the 50% marker. You are more likely than not to have been a victim of credit card fraud, which is kind of astounding if you think about it. You think you see these isolated data points and you sort of have a portrait of who suffers fraud, but you don't realize it's half of the population. Roughly speaking, by the time you are in the 70 plus bracket, you're peaking at 57%. I think that's what, yes, 57.1% of respondents 71 or older had suffered CMP fraud. And if you're in your 30s, you're more likely than not to have been a victim. So that's a great question. It really kind of shows how prevalent this is.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. As I mentioned before, if you want to ask a question, please do. The questions are under, there's a tab on the right on your webinar software. Feel free to ask them, and we will we'll get to as many as we can. Adam, the second question is about liar buyer. I know I've heard it referred to as friendly fraud. The question says, you mentioned it among wealthier demographics. Was there any information about it by age?
By age, yes. Yes. 1 second. Yeah. So liar buyer, we thought was what the most interesting was that wealthier respondents to the survey were admitting to reporting legitimate charges as fraudulent, but there was also a pretty clear split among ages. Shoppers, I think, let's see, 18 to 51 reported liar buyer activity at about similar rates, which was 16, 17% to 20, 21%. The 39 to 51 age group had the highest incidence. After that age, though, the reported rate drops, just plummets sharply. It's 8.8% for 52 to 59, and even less beyond that. So what's interesting about that is it's not just the incidents that we asked about, it's sort of, it's the attitudes. So the attitudes about liar, buyer, friendly fraud correlated strongly with age. The percentage that reported that it was never okay to report a legitimate charge as fraudulent rose consistently from age 18 all the way up to 51. More and more people said it's okay to say that it's okay to report something as fraudulent when you are dissatisfied or you're, in some cases, too lazy to return it. And the 39 to 51-year-olds have some real soul searching to do because they had the highest rate of incidents, but the fourth lowest tolerance for it. And after that, it plummets again. But it's a really fascinating sort of phenomenon in consumer behavior.
Yeah, that is fascinating to me and a little counterintuitive as well. I would have thought the opposite, but it's kind of interesting to see that the older folks are more likely to engage in this than the younger ones. Interesting stuff. One person asked, do you have any sort of data or anything around digital goods versus physical goods? Did you break things down that way in any of the categories?
We did not break things down specifically in this survey between physical and digital, mostly because I think it would have been a little tough for a survey question to kind of isolate specific shopping experiences. But if you look at riskified.com, we have a lot of reports and sort of case studies and a few white papers that kind of break down what it means to sell physical goods versus digital goods in the age of e-commerce, and sort of how that breaks down. So while we didn't ask consumers about it specifically, we do have some breakdowns of that kind of data on our website, and would encourage you to look.
Great. All right, Adam. Awesome. We're coming up on the top of the hour here, so I am going to cut it off here. If you haven't had a question answered, Adam or someone from Riskify will get back to you offline. But we appreciate Adam. Some of the stuff in here was really fantastic. I wanted to mention again that the webinar has been recorded. We will be posting it on cardnotpresent.com. I believe Riskify will post it on their site as well. But we will notify you when that recording is ready. So anybody who wants to come to the site and look under the educational resources tab of cardnotpresent.com will be able to find it. Also, I wanted to mention that a lot of these areas we will be examining at CNP Expo. CNP Expo is coming up next week in San Francisco. If you're in the Bay Area and you want to attend and learn some of these things firsthand, we have probably 30 different sessions ranging from friendly fraud to account takeover and a host of other things, recurring payments. We're on the payment side as well as the fraud side. We have a lot of information for folks who are in this business and interested in networking with their peers also to get some questions answered as well. We're going to have a ton of people and a great time all next week, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday in San Francisco. But you can see any information on that at cnpexpo.com. If you'd like to check that out, check out some information or register for that. Adam, thank you so much. I wanted to thank you and the audience for sticking in this afternoon with us, and we will see you next time. Thank you all.
Okay. Thanks again.